let's go ahead and get the session started. My name is Michael Ogia. I'm the moderator for this session, and I'm also the focal point for this workshop. And I'm an independent consultant within the internet governance ecosystem, and I've been working now on, let's say, the connection between sustainability and the internet since last year when I started writing about this topic. This is the first time, as far as I know, that sustainability in this capacity is being addressed at an internet governance. I'm sorry, at a EuroDIG event, but I don't know if that's completely true. Either way, I really want to thank some people that helped make this workshop possible, including Chris Buckridge and his staff at the Ripen CC, our remote moderator Dan, and also our rapporteur Elizabeth. And then there's also there's a local e-waste recycling organization called ESS Ringless, and they donated, and they've given us a bin to provide e-waste in case anybody brought some that they can't get rid of. So I really appreciate that, and also, so I really want to just kind of start. With the concept of sustainable access. I've been asked a few times since I've been at EuroDIG, what is sustainable access? And actually, it made me kind of think, well, what does even sustainability refer to? And I looked it up, and it's the ability for something to be maintained at a certain rate or level. So when I was thinking about how do we define sustainable access, I wrote it as it simply refers to the ability for any user to continue to connect to the internet over time. Now, what does this involve, at least as it relates to us? It involves reliable infrastructure and the kind of energy that is supplying critical internet infrastructure, or whatever is cooling servers, how much power ICTs are consuming, how such power is being generated, and the energy costs of data generation, storage, and transit. It involves sourcing, manufacturing, and recyclability of internet-connected devices. Human resources and skills are also paramount to making sure individuals can connect to the internet and stay connected. But then it's also concepts such as digital pollution and the availability of resources such as IP addresses and AS numbers. Then, of course, there's the ecological impact. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because of things like this. This is an e-waste dump. I'm not sure exactly where this one is located. I found it on, it was an unspecified place. But, you know, with the passage of the Paris Agreement in 2016, but then the recent notification of withdrawal by the United States, it's absolutely critical that we all, in our own capacities, begin to address this very urgent topic. But with that said, even within the context of internet governance, we want to connect the next billion people to the internet. Well, are we also considering the long-term viability of our current processes and practices in making sure that those people that are connected will be able to maintain that connection? You know, how will they connect? With what devices will they connect with? What happens after those devices break? Will they go to a dump like this? What will happen? And I mean, considering especially with 1 billion more people connected to the internet, that's 1 billion more YouTube videos, e-government services used, pictures shared, Skype conversations, or video conversations with loved ones, etc. And I was telling someone about this, that whenever I was telling some people about this session starting out, some people don't even know what e-waste is and how it's, for instance, exported to different countries to be disposed of. And when I say disposed of, it's just dumped. So if you look at, for instance, the EU, and we know now that it sends it to India, we know that they send it to Nigeria. Ghana has a huge e-waste dump, for instance. China has e-waste dumps as well. So the idea that the internet, we always talk about the cloud, but the cloud is not the cloud. The cloud is infrastructure, it's on the ground, it's under the oceans, it's in our world, it's on the earth. So what I really want to focus on is the fact that, more importantly, this concept is really absent from our discussions. Sustainable access is not part of our current discourse. We should not look back and address sustainability in retrospect. It should be integrated into the core of our work, public policy, and considered a basic requirement, especially since we have a role to play in, for instance, protecting the environment. Now, I just wanted to quickly address kind of what are the aims and objectives of this kind of expected outcomes we hope to get. First of all, we want to link the work of the ICT for Sustainability community. There's a lot of researchers that are doing work on sustainability, specifically how it relates to the internet and ICTs, with the internet governance community, and highlight that interconnection. There's a lot of room for work, especially as it comes to initiatives to connect people such as community networking and the like. The second one is promote sustainable access and really catalyze a paradigm shift in how we talk about connecting. And then also address why sustainability and sustainable access are relevant to Europe and the European context, which, as many of you probably know, the G20 meeting is happening next month. There was a Civil 20 group that was focusing on climate. I was part of that, just the mailing list, and I kept talking about sustainable access there as well. There's Horizon 2020, various EC initiatives that are going on with renewable energy, etc. There's, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, and sustainable access, ICTs, period, are a huge part of realizing those. And then even then, we talk about the future, whether it be at this year's Internet Governance Forum, whether it be here at EuroDIG even, we talk about the future. Sustainability must be a part of that, otherwise who knows what that future will look like. It might be a lot more grim than we hope. Ultimately, Europe is a global leader in promoting sustainability and renewable energy, and considering the environmental challenges that we face, the EuroDIG community in particular, I think, is in a prime position to make sustainability a core component of the internet governance discourse. So with that said, I just want to kind of quickly outline the session. It's a bit unorthodox, so I know it's not exactly usually implied, but given that that this session is meant to be a bridge between communities, and then so we're going to have about a 15-minute keynote presentation, and then after that we're going to go into directly into the roundtable. And I have some questions, but I really hope that each of you can drive the discussion as well. With that said, without further ado, I want to introduce one of the people that really was one of the reasons why I started doing this work, because I came across his research through Circle ID, and that really inspired me to go, wait a minute, why aren't we talking about this? And that is Dr. Mike Hazas is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University who works at the confluence of human-computer interaction and social science. His research combines qualitative and quantitative methods to understand everyday practices and technologies, how they can be related to carbon emissions and energy demand, and more sustainable trajectories. So with that said, I will give the floor over to Mike. And can we switch the presentations as well?
Thanks. Yeah. Is it? Can you hear me out of the speakers? All I hear is myself. So, oh, there we go. That's a bit better. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Let's see if I can not stand in front of my screen.
No, just 2 seconds.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. So just very quick preface. So obviously I've done this in collaboration with colleagues, which we'll talk about in a second. I also gave a version of this talk first at the conference for Computing Within Limits. That was about a year ago, pretty much exactly a year ago. And then again at a seminar series on the ethics of big data in Cambridge back in February. So there have been previous airings of these ideas, but I was really excited to be able to come here and to be contacted by Michael to talk to this community, because a lot of times I'm presenting to computer science audiences, sometimes sociologists, and we, particularly computer scientists, focus on what should designers do, how should we design the apps differently, how should we, but actually there are a lot of really important higher level, I think, policy implications and governance implications, and that's why I'm really happy to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Okay, so this was done in the context of the Demand Centre, which is a £5 million research centre based at Lancaster University over 5 years. So my immediate colleague is Janine Morley within that centre, and the Demand Centre as a whole concerns itself on understanding what energy is for. So that might be, whether it's sort of online shopping or home heating or whatever, and understanding sort of how those resources have grown over time and how those change with what people do, so everyday practice. So we work specifically on domestic IT within that larger center. I also co-direct the Socio-Digital Sustainability Group. That's based over in the School of Computing and Communications at Lancaster. And as you're probably picking up, and from some of the disciplines on this, we have human geographer and sociologists and computer scientists. I have a bit of a checkered past, so I originally come from an electrical engineering background, and then did a PhD in mobile computing, and then decided that technology and its impacts can't really be understood without understanding people. So I did a degree in sociology in order to think more strategically about socio-technical systems, and I'm interested in these broader understandings of technology and how they relate to important problems like climate change. So this whole bit of work, this kind of the argument of this talk lays out, is a response to writing by Chris Dedecker for Low Tech Magazine, which asserted that there are no limits to growth when it comes to the internet, except for the energy supply itself. So that's in contrast to things like roads and hospitals, which have physical and material constraints. The internet, because of the nature of fiber and how easy it is, A, to relay, and also to reuse with faster and faster endpoints, basically the backbones. Same thing for cellular networks. Again, we have to maintain them, we have to deployment, but it's relatively easy to do. It's not like building a national network of hospitals when we roll out, for example, 5G. So uniquely, among infrastructures, the energy use of the internet can only stop growing when energy resources run out, unless we impose some sort of self-chosen limits. So this was his assertion. We were like, that's quite interesting, and we couldn't think of anything immediately to refute that, so we thought we'd take that forward. So that's what this talk does. So the talk just goes in 4 parts. So first I'll assert, which I hope everyone here would agree with, that data traffic volumes are growing. And how those are composed. And then I'll link those to a rising energy demand due to the internet and its services. And then I'll talk a little bit about how human time and attention are also kind of linked to the growth, potentially. And obviously I'll make the assertion that human time itself probably has some sort of limit. And then I'll think about kind of machine-to-machine communication and going towards the future. So a lot of the, and obviously this is very future-oriented itself, but as I go through the first 3 points, I'll be giving lots of examples of sort of how traffic is composed, how energy demand is composed now, which I think will be hopefully of interest to this audience. Okay, so a couple quick caveats. Michael showed the picture of the e-waste site. So in any energy figures I give or growth figures, I'm not talking about the embodied emissions or embodied energy in manufacturing and transport. Those are significant, they're important, but I generally won't be talking about them. I also won't talk too much, a little bit, about the direct energy that digital stuff consumes in homes and offices and things like that. So this is the home electricity consumption in the UK, and around 35% between computing and consumer electronics, most of which is digital, is around 35%, and that's currently of demand actually, and that's increasing as a share, as a trend, partially because other categories are becoming more efficient, like lighting. So again, just returning to the assertion that data traffic volumes are growing. So this is the basic sort of per month, average per month per household broadband usage in gigabytes. So going from around 20 in 2011 up to around 87 in 2015, and it keeps going up. So there's a clear rise there. The Amsterdam Internet Exchange published kind of their traffic throughput, and again we're seeing between 20 and 40%, depending on the year, annual growth in the last 5 years. Again, this should all be, I hope fairly familiar stuff. When we talk about the internet, stuff generally does does that. So that's what all these graphs are going to do. Sandvine, has anyone run into Sandvine? They do consulting for internet service providers. Yeah, I'm seeing at least one nod. For internet service providers, and they publish aggregate figures from a selection of those providers, which they feel might be representative of the current picture. So if you aggregate their, they used to be twice yearly, now I think they're yearly, but for each region reports, you again see similar sorts of trends. So basically, volumes tend to rise steadily in North America, whereas in Europe they've doubled over the past few years. And mobile access, which is on the bottom, of course those numbers are smaller, so these are megabytes, not gigabytes, like they are for fixed lines like broadband at the top. But it still kind of grow around 50% per year. And again, Cisco and Ericsson tell us the same sorts of things, particularly for mobile traffic, around 50 to 60% per year. So that's the Cisco graph, and that's the Ericsson forecast, current state of play. And they forecast between 50 and 60% ongoing out through 2021. Which is the point there. So again, it's fairly significant. Mobile especially grows in subscribers, grows in traffic as more people get better phones, as more people get signed up, as the mobile masts get deployed in more places. But again, it applies to fixed line too, maybe just a very slightly slower growth. So that hopefully makes the case for growth. So I'll move on to kind of the energy demand due to the internet and its services. This is a survey of literature. So this is from the life cycle assessment community, which spends quite a lot of time trying to first estimate where the energy and emissions are going for various systems, food, transport, and also ICT and internet systems. And they revise their estimates every year. They argue about it. There's an occasional survey article. It's quite a lot of reading, but it's actually there's no other way of even vaguely knowing. So at least having an estimate has been really helpful. And depending on how you count it, so if you don't count all the end user stuff like laptops and phone and televisions, it's around maybe 5%, maybe 7%, depending on what you're looking at. And then once you include all the stuff that actually draws upon the internet, you're looking at about 10% of global energy goes into digital stuff. Right, and internet traffic. If anybody wants any of these references, by the way, they're in the limits paper. I'll happily share a link to that. Some of the slides I tried to reference most of the slides. So for what I was saying. So again, this shows up in the media quite a lot. Whether it's sort of cat videos or sort of assertions like Britain will shut down. The power grids will shut down based on the load of the internet, which is probably not outside the realm of possibility, but maybe won't happen tomorrow. And then as well, sort of the emissions due to data centers. There are some alternative things like sort of more and more providers are using renewable energy. There is a very strong financial incentive for them to build renewable energy alongside data centers, places like Google. But still, there's quite a lot of press coverage, including Michael's article. Which I came across independently. It was before I'd met him. So this is not a shameless plug. That was actually in the presentation before I knew I was coming. So again, if you return to the life cycle analysis literature, they also like to do forecasts and modeling to say how things might change. And again, sort of the fixed access wired use and the data centers especially are going to grow as a share as we move out to 2030. And this is their expected scenario. But again, the curve is like this, right? So if you think of if we're at 10% of global energy now, and other things are kind of fixed, like transport, air travel, those things tend to kind of grow a little bit, but not quite as quickly, then as a share, the internet is going to keep growing as a share, right? So we could see 20% by 2030, yep.
I'm a bit skeptical of the fixed access wired use. It seems quite high.
Yeah, I agree. And I wonder if that's because of just something in their model. Maybe they anticipate higher traffic. Maybe they, things do get more efficient, of course, but the efficiency doesn't keep up with the growth in traffic. But yeah, it would be interesting to know what in their model. I mean, there's sort of also best and worst case cases, right? So there's, then we might flatline. It could happen, but it could also be a lot worse. But it depends on the assumptions in the model. So I share your skepticism there. So moving on, how much things keep growing does depend on human time and attention, so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. So again, returning to some of the Sandvine data, this is the profile of peak traffic, fixed on your left and mobile on your right. And so you can see that there's, so the most significant parts being audio and video streaming with social networking and of course web browsing, which supports a number of practices and things that people do. So again, quite significant areas of practice. So really, I mean, as you probably experienced yourselves, network services have moved into many areas of daily practice, including things that didn't really involve the network or mobile devices before, like exercise, bird watching, things like that. And sort of these, sort of have kind of been part of, you might tweet about your jog, or you might whatever. So there's kind of that kind of seems to have a hand in the growth, and that people are changing how they use technology. There's also a lot more, we're able to use concurrent devices, so we can stream something on the television while we're also using our phone. Both are accessing the network, perhaps in an intensive way, right? So it's easier. That didn't used to be that. You used to sit at a laptop or a desktop and just use the internet, as it were, right? But now it's easier to use 2, maybe even 3 devices concurrently. So what do we know actually about time use online? That's a really hard thing to quantify. It's not that people haven't tried. So back in 2005, people self-reported that it was around 9.9 hours a week. That was based on surveys done by, I believe it was Ofcom, their mobile communications report. And then that's gone up to 20.5 hours a week, more recently in 2014. In the US, similarly, they surveyed time spent paying attention to digital activities, which similarly has grown, not quite double, but has increased. Again, it depends on the wording of the survey. It depends on how people think of their own, what is digital and what is not, things like that. I'd also like to point out that based on the time use survey data in the UK, there are certainly shifts. So if we compare 1974 to 2005 in the category TV, media, and games, now this is not the newest data. The newest data allows people participating in the time use survey to indicate whether there was a digital component to what they were doing, right? So they might have gone for a jog, but they can now indicate, and I use my phone on the jog, or the phone was involved, or something like that. So they're changing how they account for it. But you can already see that sort of between 74 and 2005, there are kind of shifts in how people spend their time with TV, media, and games. Perhaps maybe more in the morning, maybe a little bit less in early evening, but it gets pushed later as well. So obviously there's going to be a limit. So first of all, the global population is finite, and less than half the world is deemed to be online or have regular access to the internet. And in some parts of the world, mobile phone subscriptions are approaching saturation. So particularly in Australia and Scandinavia, where you have sort of one or slightly more than one subscription per person. But yeah, there's many more there, so that could be a limit. And of course, the hours in the day available to us is finite. We can only spend so much time not sleeping. We probably push that a lot, right? So we get less sleep, perhaps because of mobile devices, but surely there's got to be a limit there as well. So eventually, you'd think that doing this, it will eventually stop once the internet reaches more of the population, and once it takes up a certain amount of time that we just can't bear. I'd also like to start to point out that despite those, the fact that we might do similar things like, say, watch a video or listen to music or check social networking, even though those practices, what we actually do stays the same, and we might do those for the same amount of time, day to day, they can actually slowly ramp up the amount of data required. So Netflix started sort of, early with sort of fairly close to standard definition, then it went to HD, then it went to Super HD, and now you can get 4K Ultra HD. There's nothing to say that there won't be services for 3D and virtual reality, which would require even more bandwidth. And similarly, social networking have had increasingly video-based content, so that might be adverts, that might be videos created by people you know, or whatever, and they make it easier and easier to share those, and then things like Facebook's autoplay causes it to already load the video on your behalf without you necessarily having even clicked on it. So there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes which tends to ramp up the data. And actually, when Facebook switched on autoplay, there were little blips, like as in large surges, I should say, in global networks as it started to kind of autoplay those. And then, of course, there was a lot of bad press because it killed people's mobile quotas. So, okay. So there must be some kind of limit, but arguably, you know, we should probably somehow have some say in the discussion of how quickly we approach that limit and when. But as well, apart from human time, there's this big data traffic potential for non-humans, so for machines. So I'll return to my sandbine breakdown of peak traffic, and you can already see kind of marketplaces, which can be app store updates and things which are pseudo-automated, are around 6% of traffic. We did some empirical work fairly recently with around 400 participants with at least 2 weeks of data from their phone, and OS and background processes, which includes things like notifications and stuff like that, as well as updates and backups, are comprised around 15% of traffic. And this is nothing that necessarily would be fired off when they were doing stuff, or it was just running in the background. This is in addition to all the listening, watching, social networking, and other stuff that they were doing, right? So this is just happening on their behalf in a fairly automated fashion. So currently, there's the estimate's around 6.5 billion connected devices, which is starting to approach the world population. Could be 21 billion by 2020 by some estimates. Again, we've got references in the paper, where the machine-to-machine communication could be approaching half of traffic by 2021. It's arguable whether these will be particularly data intensive. I suppose in some ways they will. So you can think of things like self-driving cars, which have fairly rich telemetry, wireless cameras for off-site monitoring, that can be for home or businesses, wearable medical devices, which again have fairly sensitive, intensive data associated with them. So there's lots of potential for things to kind of keep increasing, even when we run out of time, even when everybody in the world is online using 3 devices at once. So just to wrap up, how am I on time, Michael?
You can take a couple.
Okay, yeah, good. So I hope I made the case that you know there's arguably that the internet is perhaps becoming less closely tied to human attention, although still it's still quite involved. How we use the internet is obviously very involved in its data intensities. That certain services have just been increasing. So in particular, social networking and high fidelity content delivery, video in particular. And where kind of this background connectivity and more connected things tend to be more and more common. So this kind of automation, this ongoing trend, and as well as the Internet of Things, basically more broadly, makes that long-term limit unclear. So I suppose where we got to was we probably agree with Krista Decker's original assertion that perhaps the Internet will only stop when it runs out of energy, unless we take a more active role, perhaps in its shaping. And that shaping of that dynamics is still very much up for debate, and I think we sort of would do well to kind of be part of that. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I really, I mean, the whole reason why I asked Mike to be the keynote as well is to give context to our discussion, because there's obviously a lot of data involved, there's a lot of research involved, and I wanted to make sure that this can inform our discussion. So with that said, I just want to also quickly mention that I remember when I saw his work, and whenever I saw it published on Circle ID, I remember seeing that you know, in an interview that he gave with someone, he was saying that eventually all of our energy could eventually be going to our data and to the internet. Is that correct? Was that a potential future?
I suppose that's one eventually. I mean, surely we'll keep some in reserve for transport and
Sure.
and heating and cooling.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it's hard to see how it won't keep rising as a share, and it's not clear where would it stop at 90% of global energy, 95? It's not. Yeah, it's not clear. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike. So with that said, I'm gonna, if anybody wants to speak, please speak into the microphone, just in case because we have a few online participants. I want to, before I open the floor, I want to give the floor to Marco, who's with Ripen CC, and because he wants to address specifically the fixed component that somebody was asking about.
Yes, thank you, Marco Rappens here. As you asked, like, isn't the fixed component big? And that's something that's slowly now bubbling up in policy discussions as well in terms of 5G. Is frequency spectrum is a very scarce resource, and especially at the higher frequencies that are still open, the coverage is very low. That means that basically you need a lot of antennas, and that those antennas all need a cable. I recently heard somebody refer to the middle mile now in relation to that. That could be cause for rise in sort of what's depicted as fixed wired access, because all the fibers and all the little connections going into that antenna will eat up a lot of energy. While I have the floor, if you allow me to ask a question of Mike, and that's, you show a lot of aggregates or averages on monthly basis. So my question regarding that is, as energy sector people probably know, is what kills your grid is the peak usage. And in that sense, I wonder if you have taken that into account. Second question I want to leave with kind of the panel is consider the actual energy requirements of storing data. The fact that we just park it on a disk and never look at it again, where we used to do that on tapes, and tapes don't eat energy. But these days, apparently, we store it on electronic devices. So I wonder if that's, if you can, or have you included that, or do you have an opinion on that?
So the first question was about the timing of the demand, not just the aggregate. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I didn't have time to cover it, but in the paper we just presented last month, we looked at, it was called Demand Around the Clock, actually, and it looked at the timing of demand and the timing of demand for different services as well. And the bad news is that, I mean, as you pointed out, it's all about the peak, and particularly at peak times, the carbon intensity of the grid is very high, certainly in the UK, that's true. And the bad news is that demand coincides quite nicely with peak demand. So that's partially because that's when people are watching video. That's close to prime time in the evening, cold winter nights, right? Firing up video alongside your heating. So that's kind of bad. Social networking peaks in the morning along with transport peaks, right? So as people go to work, as they wake up, as they start moving around. So again, these are linked to kind of human time and how we spend it. And right now, there are things like backups which might run at night, automatic downloads sometimes which might run at night, although sometimes those downloads run at peak times, which is certainly something addressable. So not great news there, I'm afraid. And the second question was about storage and mobile devices, is that right? Or was that for everyone?
No, yeah, well, you can start, but yeah, the fact that we tend to store data online in data centers and basically never look at it again while it still eats energy. Yeah. Nope,
that's a huge problem. I don't know, because a lot of the data centers, where your data is being stored and how that energy is provided for and how it's resourced are generally fairly secret. It's hard to account for it, which is why we have to turn to the lifecycle assessment community who do the modeling and analysis for that. But yeah, that's surely a problem because it's going to be sitting on a hard drive somewhere, and I don't know how they make decisions about how to sustainably store that or delete it, or I mean that's not transparent at all actually, which would be a huge problem for governing it, I would say. Yeah.
Please go ahead, Luca.
Yeah. Hello. Luca Belle, work for the Center for Technology and Society at LGV, and I had two comments with two questions. The first one, I found very interesting the graph you were showing about the increase of data traffic and the energy consumption of fixed network. But I wonder if that is really a problem, because if you have a simultaneous transition to renewable energy, actually, even if there is an increase, you would not produce too much waste because the increase in energy consumption would be, let's say, absorbed, or at least, let's say, the potential negative externalities would be limited by the fact that you use renewable energies to supply power you need. So actually that could be mitigated. And so I was wondering if you have considered this. And the second comment is with regard to community networks. I don't know if you are aware about the existence of community networks or crowdsourced network. We are working a lot on community network within the IGF Coalition Community Network. We even produced a report. If you want, I will be very happy to give you a copy. And what is very interesting, one of the many fascinating elements of community networks is that many of them being built in rural areas, they have also to integrate sustainable energy production tools or mechanism in order to power the various antennas and towers and routers that are used to provide connectivity to the rural community. So they automatically integrate sustainable energy production into sustainable connectivity production. So I was wondering if you had already considered this in your research, or if you have already elaborated some recommendations on how to make connectivity and fixed internet access more sustainable.
Yeah, I suppose to answer your second question, or just now, it's hard to it is hard to kind of work out what the way forward is on the sustainable networks. I think I've done some field work in Shetland. There are some communities there who've actually set up their own networks with some fairly advanced kit. Actually, it's all microwave stuff that sits on top of hills, right, and runs off of wind turbines and solar, which is fantastic. It was really great to see that. And that was, basically 8 households would group together, deploy the equipment, run a fiber cable to the nearest sort of access point, basically, so that's great, and that seems to work. They have to replace the ball bearings on the wind turbine every 6 months, but apart from that, it's fairly sustainable. So there are definitely ways forward. I'd be interested to have a look at the report, actually. So yeah, your first question was about that was about sort of renewable energy and the role of that. Yeah, I think. I had actually a similar question at St. Andrews last week when I was visiting there. I suppose, yeah, if we could guarantee that all the energy that goes into the internet going forward and its growth is renewable, then I have trouble thinking of a reason, to be worried. Then I guess if it truly is renewable, and it's kind of that would be great. The problem is that, and this does happen with things like data centers, where they'll build a geothermal plant right next to the data center, and then they're good to go, or so they claim. But the problem with the internet is it's so distributed, and once it works its way out beyond that data center and goes onto other networks, and especially with things like content distribution networks and how they rely on multiple sites, but as well like the middle mile and the last mile, those networks, all that energy is so difficult to trace, pin down. You're dealing with local peaks in different regions and things like that. So it will be, I think it's very difficult to make the case that we'll be able to just go all renewable going forward, because we just don't know where all that data's going to end up and how it's going to be used all the way down to the home. So I think we'd have to be a little careful there, just because the internet is so global, is so multi-regional. I guess.
My comment was more about given the fact that it is possible to identify what is the percentage of energy consumption produced by connected devices, at least from the graph, that was my assumption. One could argue that the same percentage should be supplied with renewable energy. I mean, policy-wise speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's an interesting idea. Can we look at the different paths of energy in the system and base the policy on that? That's a very interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody else, do raise your hand. I don't want to eat up all the panel's time, but permission to ruin somebody's day, because that does worry me, and that's in the context of IoT, and then Luca said, like, we see community networks coming online that basically harvest their own energy, and that's very sustainable. In terms of IoT, we now see what I call self-harvesting devices. Energy consumption is that low that it will kind of continue to run forever. And you started your presentation with this huge, big garbage pile of old, unused devices. And the problem is that we're spreading that out, because once you glue that sensor in the street, and that sensor is harvesting its own energy from people walking over it, the kind of only lifespan that its limiting factor is the production quality. Sadly, we've got really good at building stuff that lasts really long. So that's going to be there for 50 years. And even when it breaks, who is going to be the one that's going to unglue it from the street? So in that sense, it does worry me that on the energy, at least when you get your power from the grid, you pay a price for it, and then you know where it is. But once it sort of figures its own life out, it's really out of control.
Someone has to keep storing and processing the data from the sensor in the street, and that
It might not even, because it might just be broadcasting data that nobody is interested in listening to, but it still eats up spectrum. That's the other worry there.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic presentation. And I'm really interested because I think it was in 2010 when I attended a rather left-leaning summer school on green IT, and the focus there was really on the question, what can consumers do and how can we save time that we spend on the internet, but from the perspective of CO2 emissions. So how can we Google one thing less? And I think it goes very much counter the modern lifestyle of myself and most people to think about that. You know, I've seen myself just Google something, you know, out of just because I went on my browser, and that's the first thing I did when I thought about something. And the question is now, do you see any implications of this kind of research or of the findings for personal usage? And do you see anyone mobilizing around this? Because when I think back of things like the car or the airplane, these were technologies that rolled out and everyone was very happy to get everyone on board in the first place. But at some point it switched and people were starting to think, well, you know, you are morally doing something wrong if you drive too much with your car. Will that same thing apply to using the internet, to using Netflix at some point?
I think I can. Yeah. Okay. I think working at the user, at the individual level is quite a challenge. I mean, everyday life just gets in the way. That's the thing. I mean, I think our main challenge there is just to raise awareness initially. Like you said, these things happen slowly over time. Perhaps people will start searching less, just like at some point, they decided to. That it was bad to leave lights on and stuff like that. So at some point there might be some, sort of voluntary curbing, but I don't think it's entirely realistic, and certainly not anytime soon. But we can definitely do a lot to raise awareness. There's some other things that kind of designers and technologists who are often some of the audiences that I talk to, sort of look at, can we do things like sort of not only make the system more efficient for delivering video, using some sort of peer-to-peer distribution or whatever, but can we also clamp down on fairly intensive connections like Facebook is actually quite intensive. Facebook and other social networking sites between 20 and 30% of internet traffic globally, right? So, and that part of that is because of all that video content. So what happens if we start to clamp down on those connections just a little bit so they consume less? What content gets through? Is it the stuff that's really meaningful to people, or does the whole thing just shut down? So there's lots of different things we might try which would be maybe more automated ways of slowly reducing demand through software, effectively.
And unfortunately, I did reach out to Google and Apple, and I couldn't get in touch with Facebook, but to see if they could join us, and they weren't able to. But this is potentially a good place to go from here, like maybe next year or in a future discussion, to say, okay, how can we kind of link these two communities, the internet governance with ICT for sustainability, and the private sector to see, well, how could we leverage each other's each other's work to see how to make that better. I mean, that's one idea. I want to know if anybody else has any other ideas for that. You know,
Just a
and
piece of suggestion.
also anybody behind us.
Actually, with regard to the Internet of Things, that also was also mentioned by Marco, we are connecting almost any device that will have sensors to not only to understand, to monitor data around the device, but could exploit the same sensors to monitor the energy consumption of the device. So, well, if a device is so smart, should be able to understand how much energy is used and to communicate it. So that could be a very reliable source of information to future research. And yeah, I think that is also maybe a piece of discussion that should be integrated into the more general IoT discussion, knowing that things are being connected without any criteria and any analysis of the potential externalities that those things can produce in terms of human right assessment or environmental assessment.
It'd be great to then have product manufacturers here, whether it be, for instance, Ericsson, since they're based in Sweden, or you know, even Chinese company representatives. You know, so actually, since you just mentioned IoT, since you've also been talking about this, Mike, something that you actually even started your presentation with is you're only really addressing the energy component. We're not talking about necessarily products themselves. And did you want to add something, Kristen? So we're not talking about products themselves. Manufacturing a product. Where do those components come from? I reached out to Fairphone. I was hoping that they could make it. They weren't able to. But Fairphone is a kind of a, I guess the best way to describe it is a phone that is modular, so that you can swap out the components. And we know if you want a new camera, instead of throwing away the whole phone or getting rid of the whole phone, you just buy the new piece of the component for the camera, for instance. You know, so there are some initiatives out there, but otherwise, if we're creating a new device, where is that device coming from? What materials are they coming from? Also, something slightly related, is it coming from a conflict zone? A lot of the materials that go into phones, let's say, or to other devices, they come from conflict zones, which are already exacerbating the situation on the ground there. But you know, one thing that somebody had been talking about during the discussion, and I'm sorry, I just wanted to, you know, kind of give context to this specific part that I want to bring up, is planned obsolescence. If you're not familiar with this concept, it's the idea that many devices are only supported for 2 years, let's say, and there's, from what I gather, and I don't know if you know about this, Mike, but sometimes that 2-year mark is rather arbitrary. It's not to say that that's the only way, but then that's both at the software and the hardware level. Even though a phone that is produced can often be carried for many years longer than that. So how, I guess that one of the discussion points I had questions is, how can we cut down on planned obsolescence? And is labeling devices with their life cycles, would that be an effective way to do it? So that let's say before I buy my Nexus 5 here, I say that, oh, its components are only, you know, one of its components is going to last for 5 years. Can we make the entire phone last for 5 years then? Or, you know, that sort of thing. Basically, you know, using consumer choice. Does anybody have any opinion about this? It's okay if you don't, or if anybody have any thoughts about this? Oh, sure.
Hi, I'm Rosi Bocco from Romania. I'm here as an environmental educator. And I think that the end user level is very important, as you guys mentioned. And also the personal examples, this planned obsolescence thing could be thought on a personal level, but it's very difficult. In order to exchange components in my 7-year-old Mac, we had to import screwdriver sets from 3 countries. So you are not encouraged to fix your things. But there are very good movements like the one Restart project in the UK. I know from the green movement, I'm also an environmental activist. And if you have the opportunity to push the agenda, the research agenda, to push forward the research on this area, to get funding for researching, to get reliable data, not only large-scale aggregated, maybe not so relevant data for local communities. That's a must, and the fact that this workshop is here now is a good sign that it is moving. The issue is moving from a personal and small scale to a political and policy level. On the other hand, there is the systemic impact. You cannot have a systemic impact if you don't work on an institutional level with the big players. But until then, should we wait for Santa Claus or do what we can? And my idea is that don't wait for Santa Claus. We do what we can. So we educate our students, we educate our families, our peers, to fix their stuff, to reuse some of the ICTs in a way that is not only creative but also functional. I don't think that we should keep our ICTs as we keep at home to reuse it sometime in the future. We should push forward local actors and regional actors, because that's the level where you can make a difference. I think as an individual, I mean, as an active individual, and also at an institutional level. Who says you cannot do selective I don't know the word in English, when you collect waste in a selective way? Oh. No, they just collect selectively the waste in an institution, or don't print as much as you could, or to put a policy. I'm a department director, and it's a policy that the equipment have to be switched off, for instance. But it's a very small local decision, or that you print as little as possible. So what's such a big deal to build a green office? That's the personal small level, and this is the bigger level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're gonna come to some of the points that you were making toward later in the session. I want to keep it for sure. But does anybody have anything to add about? Oh, I don't know if you had about specifically with either a response to her points, or with something about planned obsolescence and the importance of ensuring our material, how we're connecting to the internet, are recyclable or manufactured in a way that are sustainable.
Yeah, I got something to say about that. My name is Auke Pals. I'm from the Netherlands. And I guess we're throwing too much devices away which are still functioning quite well. But the thing is hardware and software. Now the software manufacturers are spending 95% of the time on supporting devices that are older than the newest. So for innovation, that's really, not good. But as consumer, we want to have the new devices, we want the new software. But the new software does require a better hardware. So maybe there should be something in between, that we won't get an update that requires all the hard stuff, but only some of the little updates. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I do know what you mean. Marco, did you want to speak? Or Chris, did you want to say something as well? I don't. Yeah.
Maybe I'm less worried about consumer electronics. it's always then call for regulation. But I mean, we've fixed the bottle system by putting a deposit on it in many countries, and we fixed the can system by putting a deposit on it. And I personally don't see why I can't leave a deposit when I buy a phone. That is an incentive for me to bring that phone back when I buy the next phone. And in that sense, I think that chain, we've got prior experience. We know how to control it. We know how to incentivize it. What I'm more worried about is the collective and institutionalized systems, the stuff that nobody really owns. And that's really, and that's where a lot of the IoT devices come in. But for instance, also the cables we put into the ground. 50, 60 years. A fiber, the theoretical lifespan of a fiber is 40 years. Most of the fibers went in there sort of late 90s, early 2000s. So in about 10 years' time, we're probably going to decommission the first few trunks. And I don't know. I haven't heard anybody on like how to dig them up or any smart way of unplugging a fiber. And the stupid thing is, if it's a copper cable, people have an incentive to dig it up because it's worth money. Even if it's made of lead, you can still make a buck out of it. Second-hand fiberglass, I haven't found a market for it yet. So there is no incentive there. And also with the burst of the bubble, a lot of the original companies who put it in went bust. Something to think about. And I don't have a solution for that one. Your phone is the easy part, I'm afraid.
On the theme of better, maybe I guess I would say sort of citizen or user awareness and engagement. You were talking about the planned obsolescence. So I think we could envision like an energy or kind of a eco-labeling basically for devices. I mean, why not, right? So there might be some things which are C and some things which are A and A+, right? And of course, as time goes on, as it has with refrigerators, the goalposts will move, right? Where then you have to have an A++ and an A+++, right? But still, at least something is better than nothing. Because right now, what we have is nothing. You just go and you buy a phone, and you buy it without considering maybe that it was, materials had to be extracted from the ground and coal had to be burned in the Far East in order to build it, right? So that's one thing. And you could also even envision some eco-labeling for software. So you could look at, you could maybe look at sort of films that you might stream that might have an eco-label, right? So a 4K film, which takes 7+ megabits per second, might have an eco-label of a D or perhaps a C, right? Because you might watch the same film in Super HD, HD, or even standard definition, and then the rating would go up to B, A+, right? And again, at least, of course, people will still pick the 4K if they have a big display that's capable of displaying. They would of course pick that, but at least there's an awareness there, right? So yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I wanna come back to that last point because I do think that the market provides incentives there. Because when I go to Apple iTunes, the SD version is cheaper than the HD version, so there is an incentive there. And actually, on the streaming service Netflix, at least in bandwidth users, Netflix will automatically scale down if they don't think they have the bandwidth to deliver. And I can easily see that extend to, okay, I don't have the energy to deliver, so let's scale down. Coming back to your point, I dug it up in my phone. If I go to a general and there's a regulatory tab, somewhere in the middle is at least a little icon that says that I should not just throw it into the general waste. So there is labeling, it's hidden, but there is a little sign here saying I should not just toss it away.
And similarly, we could even label apps. So you might have Facebook might have a certain rating, or sort of maybe an instant messaging client based on Jabber might have a certain rating, right? As well. So you can envision ratings for apps, not just media. So.
Please, Ro.
Hey, my name is Ro Plummer from the Electronic Frontier Finland, and well, I got a little case for you. I bought a TV some 6 or 7 years ago, and after the first year, pretty much 1 week after the guarantee had finished, the TV broke, and the reason was a a blown capacitor in a telly. I just did a Google on that problem. There's 1.9 million hits on that with Samsung, and I was wondering. The first time, luckily, in Finland, we got pretty good consumer protection. They still agreed to fix the TV for no extra cost. Although I did have to pay for the transportation there and back, which was like 50 euros. And we were talking about a part which cost about €1. Right. Yeah. So I did that. Well, they fixed it, and the same thing. It had the same symptoms again, like 1 year after. And I was like, oh, this just can't be happening. Like, it's got the same fault. What's happening? Then I did a search, and I found out that, yeah, a lot of people have exactly the same problem with exactly the same telly. And then, well, I had a friend who's a bit more of an electrical genius than I am. And so he was just like sort of watching over what I did. It was really easy. I changed the part, and now it's worked 6 years just fine. I just gave it, the capacitor could take a little more power in there, and that's all I needed to do. It's worked 6 years fine since then. And my question is, would there be any kind of, like, can you think of any kind of regulatory or some other kind of solution that would actually prevent companies from doing this planned obsolescence? I think the example of this telly is exactly that. They've put in a component that will blow up in about 1 year's time.
Well, if I can just quickly answer that, one of the organizing team members that I had been put in touch with, she had said, how amazing would it be if there could be a regulation out there that says something to the extent of a device must be supported until its lowest, to its least component is no longer able to be maintained, or something like that. So basically, instead of having a device, instead of having a component that lasts for 1 year and then the other components last for 3 years, imagine if everything else could just be for 3 years. And so that could be at the regulatory level. I don't know how realistic that is, but at the same time, again, it would have been incredible, for instance, if somebody, I had been in touch with the EC, and there was somebody at the EC that is actually quite interested in these issues. Unfortunately, again, he couldn't make it to Tallinn. And so there is definitely room for discussion about this. I would say there's room to discuss it with the regulators specifically, in addition, or in collaboration with the private sector, etc. But that's just one little bit. I wanted to go to Mike real quick. Did you have something that you wanted to say? I thought you were raising your hand. No. Oh, sorry. Marco. And Marco and then you.
Would you ever buy a Samsung television again?
Sorry?
Would you ever buy a Samsung television again?
Well, it's lasted fine since I repaired it myself. Maybe it's lasted really well since then.
Okay, well, I mean, that came up in our workshop yesterday. Is sort of Mike shares things are replaceable as long as I think consumers have a choice. Wouldn't the market autocorrect this kind of things?
Well, there's also just quickly, I mean, there's also the concept of the circular economy. This is becoming more, this is growing in general. It's the idea that, whenever something is being designed and then ultimately produced, it should not, right now, our current timeline is that something is designed, it's produced, and then it's just thrown away. And then what happens to it, who knows? The circular economy, it's more that it's designed, it's produced, and then it, like a circle, it kind of goes back. Once it's no longer used, it gets recycled, its components go back, whatever is recycled is recycled, used again, or it's melted down. The idea is that it creates, so even in our manufacturing processes, there's a significant issue in the sense of how are we approaching it? Are we approaching it with the sustainability in mind, or are we approaching it purely from a, let's say, the bottom line perspective, and how many units can we ship? How much can we make, for instance? Just quickly, I wanted to go to you and then Luca.
Walter Lucien from Luxembourg. So I'm a little bit ill. When I think on companies forced to support their technology a bit longer. My first thought was, well, it might block the innovation part, but my second thought will be, if I look on my iPhone, which will be changed every year with some minor improvements, I guess if they were forced to hold them 2 years, we have, well, not the iPhone 7s, 8s, and so on, but we will have the iPhone 7 and then the iPhone 8 2 years later with a really innovation part, because it's from the costing part more efficient to make a great update with the resources and all components than to have those short upgrades just to get the people to buy new stuff because it's marketing. So we in Luxembourg have one initiative which called Digital Inclusion, and you can spend your old devices like computers, smartphones, laptops, TVs, and they will be repaired by refugees, and they teach the electronical part and the IT administration stuff, and then they were spent to refugees to get access to the internet, and then we have cooperation with the local training offerer who provide online training so they can, in the time where they are not able to get a job or not allowed to get a job, to can learning the language, to learn some stuff, some teams. So it's something that could be more global and European, I guess. It's a quite good initiative.
Win. I think there's like 2 other wins in there. Like it's like across the board. You're just helping all everywhere. Luca, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I had 2 questions actually. I wanted to ask to Mike if, well, because I was thinking, hearing the discussion, is that many problems could be solved with some corporate social responsibility for entrepreneurs that could have an obligation to recycle at least the components of the product that they sell. And so I wanted to ask you if you have ever tried to elaborate some recommendations to this extent, and if you have ever had the possibility to speak with policymakers, and what was their reaction in case this happened. And the second comment that really banged into my mind when I thought the second time about the graph on internet traffic is that I was wondering if you have ever considered the consumption, both the energy consumption, the traffic consumption of blockchain. Because, and if not, that could be a very good path for research, because we all speak about blockchain as the solution for every problem we have in the world, but we always forget that to create every block of the chain, you need a lot of nodes that solve cryptographic enigma that consumes a crazy amount of energy and of bandwidth. So I was wondering if you have already considered this in your research.
For the record, Luca, I did bring that up yesterday as a point in the blockchain session, but what were you going to say?
Thanks for those questions. I guess in short, the answer to both of them is no. So the answer to the longer answer is I haven't really been able to interact with sort of basically policy stakeholders, and that was one reason I've come here. So that's been so not really. I mean, although it varies by country, sort of in many sort of I guess European and in Canada and the United States, you can go to the manufacturer and insist they recycle it. I think they have to. Right, so if you take it to them, there's no incentive for you to do so. But if you take it, then there is some kind of obligation there. But it varies, and I think that's the trick, is that it varies globally, and so there is no unified strategy. There is no unified way necessarily of getting them to recycle it. Even though in many places they do have to, if you take it to the right place, if you know where that place is. But yeah, that's something we should think more about. And the second thing is, the blockchain thing is really really interesting one. I've not looked at it yet. I'm involved on a project which will be starting up in August with the University of Edinburgh, and I keep teasing the principal investigator there because it's using blockchain to dictate transactions for solar generation in sub-Saharan Africa. So I keep telling him that basically the blockchain is going to eat up all the energy that they generate. So I'll be interested to see how that works. Obviously, the longer blockchain goes on, the more complex it becomes, the more energy consumed. So hopefully for this particular solar project, it'll be small enough that it won't actually eat all the energy. But yeah, actually, there's kind of a broader point that I wanted to touch on just briefly. So we've been talking a lot about kind of awareness and sort of eco-labeling and maybe sort of end user awareness in particular, citizen awareness. But I guess I'd want to hear kind of the reaction of some of the people here of whether kind of on the note of corporate responsibility, social responsibility, there, in a way, there is no. One of the phrases we throw around in the demand center at Lancaster is that there is no policy which is not also energy policy, because in the end, policy is about the allocation of resources in society, and so it's hard to make policy which doesn't actually end up moving energy around or justifying energy expenditure in some way or not. And I guess having a lack of policy on internet and its growth is kind of basically we're hands off in terms of the energy, and that's one reason anyway you see it doing this. The other reason is that people are spending a lot more time online and a lot more devices and stuff like that. But again, that's not necessarily a given. It doesn't have to be that way. And I guess what I wanted to kind of throw out was, does it make sense? Is it realistic to engage with companies? So I guess if you might say, well, with the explosion of video, whether it's advertising or user content on social networking, that's the reason we've seen it rise to 20-30% of global traffic, for example. But if it had stayed text and picture-based, we would probably have a very different state of affairs right now, for example. Another thing is, there are certain checks in place, as you were pointing out, with video. It depends on the screen size, it depends on your bandwidth, and in particular, a 4K subscription to Netflix costs more, so that surely will be some sort of cap. It doesn't cost much more, but at some point it might be free. So I guess, is there any mileage in engaging companies to justify decisions that they're making on these huge global scales regarding millions of devices, right? Does it make sense to ask them to justify the extra energy that, for example, a software update which increases the video fidelity or the video content? Does that even make sense? I don't know. I mean, that would be a corporate social responsibility thing, right? Because when they roll out that update, it has raised energy demand during peak times all over the world, right? So,
Chris, and then Elka.
Thanks, Michael. I've sort of had some thoughts here which I've been actually holding back for the session, partly because I was sort of thinking, what's the connection? How do we sort of substantiate the connection with all of this to internet governance, this process we have? And part of why I was sort of holding that back is actually that there's been a lot of discussion here today, actually, of really quite practical measures that can be taken, which I think was one fear that maybe it wouldn't. And what I'm, I guess, going to do is actually go much more out to the sort of paradigm sort of level. And I think that your question there cuts to that a little bit. I think one thing that's clear with this discussion relating to internet governance is that what internet governance often means is not sort of internet policy. It's going to relate to all sorts of policies. It's going to relate to manufacturing policy. It's going to relate to energy policy. It's going to relate to corporate policy. All of these things that the internet affects and internet touches on, but are not necessarily what you would think of as internet governance. But internet governance has an opportunity for us to have input there, which is valuable and useful. But I think then sort of also we need to think of it in terms of an internet governance paradigm, or internet paradigm even. And one of the things I think, sort of the cliches of talking about the internet in whatever context, is this sort of marvel at how quickly it's grown. There's sort of, so many presentations will start off with, it was only 30 years ago that the internet was this size, and now it's this size, and everything's up and to the right, and the scale is all incredible. That's the paradigm of the internet, that it's one of growth. When we, even now we talk about internet for development. There's that development. How do we get to the next billion, the final billion? It's all about growing this technology. And there has to be a limit to that, I think. We have to sort of, at some point, turn around and say, maybe it's not about internet governance for development, maybe it's about internet governance for sustainability, for about how we actually treat this technology in a way that we're going to be able to continue to have it without destroying the planet, without destroying anything. And I think, to maybe go in a slightly pessimistic way, even from some of the discussions in different sessions here, we've seen signs of what you could argue are that we've already moved into that sort of unsustainable phase. And for example, we talk about the IoT, and we talk about the fact that there is this sort of problematic cycle where customers want to pay less because they're tiny devices and you don't want to pay for them. manufacturers see the possibility to spend less on manufacturing them by cutting corners on security, and they don't actually see a downside to that. So there's this sort of unvirtuous cycle which continues, but I think that's an example of not a sustainable model, still very much a growth model. So maybe, and another example even for IP addressing, so we're looking at carrier grade NAT now, where technology is sort of looking at managing the growth of the number of users, the number of applications using things by putting more users on a single IP address. And then what are the downsides for that? We had law enforcement over here today telling us exactly what the downsides of that are for them. So again, a model that allows for growth, but maybe doesn't allow for sustainability. So perhaps what we need to do sort of at a very high level internet governance paradigm is to sort of change that and start to say, okay, well, as we look at what the outputs of internet governance would be, whether it's engaging with policymakers, engaging with corporate users, maybe part of what we need to be focusing on there is how do we actually build in sustainability as an idea to what people are doing and how we're building the internet.
And I can just say, Chris, that's exactly what my kind of long-term goal is with something like this. It's how can we make this? But the thing is, though, and well, first of all, two things. So the first is that I mean, for instance, I think the IGF theme last year was on sustainable and inclusive growth or something. Nobody talked about energy at all. And I was just like pulling my hair out, what little is left, and thinking to myself, like, why aren't we talking about energy? And I felt like I was becoming almost fervent at one point, just like, you're talking about sustainable growth, but there's no energy. But at the same time, if we look at other aspects, especially when it comes to development, I'm sorry, I'm looking at this side and not this side. But especially when it comes to development, you know, I know Luca, for instance, community networking, they know exactly why energy is so important. A lot of the community networks that exist around the world, they're in underserved areas, they're in remote regions, they're in places that are very far from population centers. A lot of these places, for instance, that Luca and the colleagues that are involved with with this initiative, they're going into centers that don't even necessarily have grid electricity. So how are we supposed to connect people to the internet if we don't even have the energy to power the routers or the satellite connectivity that we have, or the the radio frequencies, the spectrum, or the TV white space, for instance? All of these are technologies that are used to connect remote regions. I mean, like, they know the importance of that. What I hope is that, especially us that are not so removed, that are very removed from those rural and remote regions, how can we also incorporate that into our work and, again, to catalyze this paradigm shift, so that something like energy, we're not struggling to incorporate into the discourse, but is something that is a given, something that is just a given. Go ahead, and then Alka, if you had your point as well.
Just a very quick response. I mean, because I think one thing I would want to make the point is that I think the development paradigm is still very important. I think there's certainly reason to sort of look at sort of how do we grow this equitably? How do we make sure that everyone has the benefits that they get from that? So that's certainly one thing. I think maybe maybe to give it a slightly more optimistic spin, I think there are areas where there is still, I mean, and the example of Spectrum is one, I think. I mean, I think the ITU and the work that's going on in Spectrum there, that's a sort of environment and a community, or whatever, a field where they're very much aware of the limits of their resource, and they have sort of history and experience in, okay, how do we use this? How do we reclaim it? How do we make sure it's and the whole thing about white space that's now going on is perhaps an example of that. But again, the IoT thing is perhaps also throwing a spanner into even that process, where spectrum use is suddenly being used by a whole lot more things, and are those existing processes that something like the ITU has going to be able to scale quickly enough to continue to use the spectrum there in a sustainable way?
Auke Pals, the Netherlands. I want to throw up another problem, because I just read an article about that every 2 years we create as much data as we did forever lie. And I also read kind of the same story in 2010, and then it was 7 years. So it's growing exponentially, as you said. But I guess it's just an assumption that also has to do with backups, because we're making a backup, and after that making a backup of a backup. And how can we as how can private and public sector solve that problem? Would that be? That's a question for the panel.
There is no panel.
Okay, for this round table.
If nobody has a direct point to make about that, I mean, what it can be is like that is a good point, and what it amounts to is that can continue to add, that it continue to be a footnote on the discussions of like there are these outstanding questions that we don't necessarily have answers to right now. I'm going to ask Elizabeth if you can start kind of creating the messages that we can create for the session, and as you're doing that, I just maybe the last question that we can get to today. I'm really excited about the fact that there is so much to talk about. But the last question that I had is, and Chris broached the issue, but it's how can the internet governance community specifically do more? What do we need to do in order to start it to kind of make that paradigm shift happen? Because I like getting up and talking about sustainability, and maybe it's quaint or endearing for a little bit, but after a while, somebody might start throwing something at me. But how can we make this something that other people are buying into?
Primarily continue the discussion here. I think this is especially with things like an IGF or EuroDIG that it's good, because one of the then we're sadly running out of time, so we'll leave that for next year's session. I guess is also. There's a bit of Chris's points and people commenting. It's also to recycle responsible, because and if people brought up like Spectrum, the old GSM standard 20 years ago was written with a 20-year lifespan. Modern devices are far more energy efficient. We can't switch off GSM because there's still a handful of people using an old-fashioned phone. And that's the dilemma that also then on the technology part you're faced, because if we say like, okay, we can be much more energy efficient, we're gonna switch off GSM. Everything is gonna be 4G. And then you've got a mess. Oh, but you're wasting valuable resources in making a device unusable. And then we saw the same with television switch-offs and switchovers. And I think especially in, it's not as much the internet, but in terms of a multi-stakeholder dialogue, you have to look at all sides of this. And it's going to take time, because everybody has their own little thing. And of course, nobody wants to waste money or waste energy in things that they don't see a direct return on. And I think that's the biggest nut to crack. A lot of this is future work. There is no direct return.
And I mean, getting more stakeholders around the table that can address this, and also inform us about what they're doing to address these problems and these challenges, I think is also quite important. But yeah, quickly, Luca.
Legal perspective, I would also argue to exploit what already exists. I mean, since the 90s, there is a convention on climate change in the Aarhus Convention in Europe that also defines not only the right of the general public to be informed and to participate to discussion, but also foresees the creation of institution. I mean multi-stakeholder institution that we all love in the intergovernance environment are to a great extent modeled on environmental governance. So this the multi-stakeholderism is not really an invention of internet policy geeks. It's something that already exists in the environmental environment. Sorry for that.
For sure. I mean, if we're going to address this, it's going to have to be multi-stakeholder.
And there are already national agencies and processes that are built on this format. So I think a very good idea would be maybe to include into the debate those agencies, starting from the next excellent debate you will organize, Mike.
Thank you very much, Luca. So, Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it over to you. Can you give us our messages?
Yes. So I've come up with 4 broad points. First one is, as data traffic goes up with an increase in user numbers, IoT technologies, and machine-to-machine traffic, so does energy consumption, and the internet will account for a relevant share of global energy consumption in the future. There has to be an effort made to monitor and address this foreseeable rise in a sustainable way. The second point would be planned obsolescence and decreasing incentives to repair devices leads to a lot of e-waste. Eco-labeling could bring an incentive for consumers to invest in more sustainable devices, and this might be used for software in a similar way. On a regulatory level, a switch to a circular economy model should be made a policy goal. Next up, sustainability also manifests on a societal level, and the internet will gain even more significance as more people are connected to it. Projects and policies that address ecological issues and find a solution that involve a sustainable social benefit shall be put forward. And my last point would be internet governance processes should acknowledge a responsibility to incorporate sustainability in the discussions.
Does anybody disagree with those, or are those all okay based on consensus? Okay, then wonderful. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I want to say, first of all, I just want to thank the tech team for all of your help with this. I want to, of course, this is something that's not very often, but I don't know who's captioning, but could you just write your name? Hi, Mary. Oh, hi, Mary Kay. Thank you very much for captioning the session. You're working remotely, but I really appreciate your work as well. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Dan for remote moderating, to Elizabeth for being our reporter. Of course, so much to Mike for coming all the way here to Thailand and being a part of this, and hopefully creating more bridges between the work that you do in your networks with what we do. And especially, I know that's okay. And especially, I really. Absolutely, I can't thank all of you enough for coming to this. This means so much to me. I really want to continue to push for this topic and advocate for this. Thank you for your support, and let's try and work even harder to see how we can continue to engage in these discussions, engage with new stakeholders, with the stakeholders that need to be at the table as well, and see how we can continue to make the internet more sustainable. Thank you all so much.